Some of you may know who Penn Jillette is. He's one half of Penn and Teller, the kind of Vegas show, comedy and illusion. He is someone who's never been shy about his disbelief in God as an atheist. He's often writing about his convictions, speaking about his convictions. But he once shared a story about the time a very gracious Christian businessman gave him a Bible as a gift. And Penn goes on to talk about this story and use the story as an opportunity to point out that Christians who don't evangelize must really hate people. I'll read that again. That's what he says. The Christians who do not evangelize must really hate people. Here's the direct quote from him. He says, "I've always said that I don't respect people who do not proselytize. I don't respect that at all. If you believe that there's a heaven and a hell and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life or whatever, and you think that, well, it's not really worth telling me this because it would make it socially awkward. And of course, atheists think people shouldn't proselytize, saying just leave me alone and keep your religion to yourself. But how much do you have to hate somebody to not proselytize them? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe that everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? I mean, if I believed beyond the shadow of a doubt that a truck was coming to hit you and you didn't believe it, and that truck was bearing down on you, at a certain point, I'm going to tackle you. And this is more important than that." So here is an atheist who understands the urgency of the matter. If it's true, then yes, it's the most urgent and important thing in the universe. And in Paul's encouragement and instruction to young Timothy, his final charge sits within that context, that urgency. Paul is getting closer to the end of his days. He feels it coming. He senses it. And he recognizes more than ever that the time is fleeting. The days are running out. Christ is coming. And so young Timothy, preach the word. And the question for us in 2020, in our modern world, in our personal lives, is do we feel this sense of urgency? Do we feel this sense of passion and zeal? And what might be keeping us from feeling that urgency would be a really good question for us to ask. And I think the answer to that question today becomes clearer when we look and explore the hearing of the gospel that Paul talks about in verse 3. Look with me at verse 3. "For the time is coming," he writes, "when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths." Last week, we focused a bit on what Paul described as sound words, healthy words that build up, that help us treasure the gospel instead of toxic or misleading words that often bring confusion or can wreak havoc in our lives, eventually that kind of lead us or pull us away from God. But Paul is saying that this is what's coming. There is coming a time when people just won't listen to sound teaching. They won't desire it any longer, especially when there is opposition or some type of persecution or trouble that is visiting the world. It becomes easier in those moments for people to not want sound teaching, sound words. Instead, people will have what he calls itching ears. They'll find the teachers and what they want to hear that suits their own passions. In other words, what people prefer is something that just kind of comes into their ears and kind of tickles their eardrums, but doesn't penetrate deep down inside our minds and our hearts. And Paul is telling Timothy that what many people will want is to hear what suits their desires and interests instead of the truth of the gospel. And so even more, Timothy, preach the gospel.